the most famous Russian vodka on earth, is not made in Russia. It hasn't been for over 20 years. It's made here, in Riga, Latvia, in a factory the Kremlin cannot touch. A factory that, right now, as you watch this, is fighting for its life, tens of millions of euros in debt. For decades, this bottle stood for Moscow itself in every bar from New York to Tokyo. It wasn't just a Russian vodka, it was the Russian vodka. And behind it is one of the strangest corporate wars in history. On one side, a secretive billionaire who bought 43 Soviet vodka brands for about $300,000 and ended up on an international wanted list at Moscow's request. On the other side, the Russian state itself with its prosecutors, its courts, and, in the end, a war that dragged the brand down with it. This fight has lasted a quarter of a century. It has been fought in courtrooms in more than 20 countries. It survived boycotts where Americans poured vodka away in protest. Twice, 39 years apart. It involves an alleged death threat that became a criminal case, a court ruling that split Europe in two, a ransomware attack, a bankruptcy in Texas, and a brand so toxic to its own owner that he erased its name from every bottle. 2 owners, 1 vodka, and in the end, nobody may be left standing. This is a story about how the thing that makes you famous can become the thing that destroys you. This is the story of the vodka Russia lost and could never take back. To understand why Russia wants this bottle back so badly, you need to understand what Stolichnaya meant. The name literally means of the capital. It was born in the Soviet Union, and even its birthday is a state secret of sorts. The trademark says 1938. The recipe legend says 1944, and the first confirmed production came in 1948. The USSR wasn't great at record keeping. It was, however, great at one thing, making this vodka famous. While ordinary Soviet citizens queued for bread, Stolichnaya went abroad to earn hard currency. The story goes, it took a gold medal at an international fair in Bern in 1953. And by the 1970s, it had pulled off something almost impossible. It became a luxury import in capitalist America. That happened thanks to one of the strangest deals of the Cold War. In 1972, PepsiCo wanted into the Soviet Union, but Soviet rubles were worthless outside the USSR. So they struck a barter deal. Pepsi syrup would flow east, and Stolichnaya would flow west. Pepsi became the first American consumer product made in the Soviet Union, and Stoli became America's window into Moscow. By 1980, Americans were buying more than 1 million cases a year. It had become the #2 vodka in the country. And when the Soviets later ran out of things to trade, they famously started offering Pepsi, warships. That deal became a legend of its own, and it's a story we'll tell another day. But fame cuts both ways. In 1983, when the Soviets shot down a Korean passenger jet, Americans dumped Stoli into Boston Harbor, a vodka party staged on the very spot of the Boston Tea Party. The brand had become so Russian that it bled every time Moscow did something monstrous. Remember that. It's going to happen again. Because in 1991, the country that owned Stolichnaya did something no one had planned for. It disappeared. When the Soviet Union collapsed, everything it owned was suddenly negotiable. Factories, oil fields, airlines, and brands. The state export monopoly that held the vodka trademarks was reorganized, privatized, renamed. In the chaos of the 90s, paperwork was power, and nobody read the paperwork more carefully than a young trader named Yuri Shifler. Shifler was 24 when the USSR fell. Army service, then the wild new world of post-Soviet business, trading houses, department stores, an airline stake, picking up an economics degree along the way. By 1997, he had quietly gathered control of the privatized vodka company. And in December of that year came the move that would define his life. A new company was registered. Its name was almost identical to the old state enterprise, Soyuz Plodo Import, minus a single letter, O. Say them out loud, you can't hear the difference. That was the point. And into this company, for roughly $300,000, went the trademarks of 43 vodka brands, including Moskovskaya, including Stolichnaya. $300,000. A decade later, Pernod Ricard would reportedly discuss buying Stolichnaya alone for around €1 billion. If that price sounds impossible, Russian prosecutors thought so too. To Shifler, it was a legal purchase in a legal market. To the Russian state, it was the theft of the century, dressed in notary stamps. Shifler moved the brands into a Dutch holding company, out of Russia's reach. He was building a fortress out of jurisdictions, and just in time, because in 1999, the police came. By the company's own count, its offices were raided 28 times in a single year. The 90s were over. Someone new was moving into the Kremlin, and, at least the way Stoli's lawyers would later tell it, he was about to take this very personally. In 2000, Vladimir Putin became president, and according to Stoli's own court filings, reclaiming the Soviet vodka brands became a state project almost immediately. It moved fast. In October 2001, Russia's highest commercial court ruled that the 1990s privatization had never been legally completed. 17 trademarks, Stolichnaya, Moskovskaya, and more, were handed back to the state, which created a special federal enterprise to hold them. No compensation, at least none Shifler's side ever saw. Inside Russia, his company simply ceased to own the thing it had bought. Then came the criminal cases, trademark violation, then organized crime, then a charge that sounds like a movie scene. The head of the new state vodka enterprise, a former deputy agriculture minister, told investigators that Shifler had threatened to kill him over the phone. That accusation, never proven in any court, became a criminal charge of its own. In 2002, Shifler left Russia and didn't come back. By March 2003, he was on an international wanted list. Think about that. A man whose business was selling vodka was now hunted like an arms dealer. The case would hang over him for 16 years, until it was finally closed under an amnesty. No trial, no verdict. The Kremlin had won at home, completely. Inside Russia, the state now owned Stolichnaya, and the courts, the police and the prosecutors all agreed. There was just one problem. The world is bigger than Russia. The trademarks in America, in Europe, in Asia. Those were registered to Shifler's companies, in places where a Moscow court ruling was just a piece of paper. The vodka itself needed a new home too, and the home he chose was almost poetic. A small country that had just escaped Moscow's empire and was about to join NATO. In Riga, Latvia. On the banks of the Daugava River stands a drinks factory older than the Soviet Union itself, built in 1900 under the Tsar, Latvia's Balsams. Ask anyone in the Baltic drinks trade, everyone knows this building. Around the year 2000, as Moscow closed in, Scheffler's SPI group moved Stolichnaya's export production here and then bought into the factory itself, eventually taking control. The recipe stayed surprisingly Russian at first. Raw spirit came from a distillery in Tambov, deep in the Russian heartland, and was blended in Riga with Latvian artesian water. Russia answered with regulation. In 2010, it banned exporting vodka in bulk, a rule widely seen as aimed at one company. SPI adapted, the way it always did. New suppliers, new routes, same bottle. And Riga delivered. In a single year, by the company's own count, this factory produced over 25 million litres of Stolichnaya. One plant in a country of under 2 million people, supplying so-called Russian vodka for the entire world outside Russia. It became one of Latvia's biggest taxpayers. For Latvia, it was jobs and money. For Schiefler, it was something better, an EU flag over his production line. Moscow could put him on wanted lists all day long. It could not send prosecutors to Riga. So Russia did the only thing left. If it couldn't take the factory, it would take the name, country by country, courtroom by courtroom. What followed was one of the longest trademark wars ever fought. And when it finally ended, it wouldn't have one winner. It would have two. For 2 decades, 2 companies, one owned by an exile, one owned by the Russian state, sued each other over the same word. On every continent. In the United States, Russia lost. American courts ruled that the Russian state enterprise didn't even have the right to sue. And Stoli stayed with Schiefler. In Australia, after a case that ran 20 years, Schiefler won again. The final judgment came in 2024. But in the Netherlands, everything flipped. Dutch courts ruled that the Soviet privatization had never legally happened, and that Scheffler's company had grabbed the trademarks in bad faith. In 2020, the Dutch Supreme Court made it final. In Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, Stolichnaya belongs to Russia. By now, Scheffler's side had reportedly spent around $200 million on lawyers. And then, in June 2021, came the ruling that carved Europe in two. A single court in The Hague decided the fate of the brand in 13 countries at once. 6 of them, including the UK and Ireland, went to the Russian state. 7, including France and Spain, stayed with the exile. Same bottle, same word, 2 owners, depending on which border you cross. Along the way, the war produced moments of pure absurdity. In 2013, when Russia passed its anti-gay laws, bars in New York started boycotting Stoli as Russian vodka, pouring out the product of the one man the Kremlin wanted in handcuffs. The company had to explain that it was Luxembourg-based, bottled in Latvia, and being hunted by Russia itself. It didn't fully work. The brand was still wearing its Soviet birthmark, and that birthmark was about to become a curse. Because on February 24th, 2022, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, and being Russian became the worst thing a brand could be. Within days of the invasion, history repeated itself, almost scene by scene. American governors ordered so-called Russian vodka pulled from store shelves. Bars filmed themselves pouring Stoli away, 39 years after Boston Harbor. And once again, they were punishing a bottle that wasn't Russian. New Hampshire alone reportedly pulled hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of bottles that had been made. In Latvia, by a company owned by a man Russia had hunted for 20 years. Scheffler had seen enough. In March 2022, he did something almost no businessman ever does. He killed his own crown jewel, The word Stolichnaya, the name he had spent 2 decades defending, was erased from the bottles. From now on, it would just be Stoli, made in Latvia. The last drops of Russian raw spirit were replaced with spirit from Slovakia. The company's message was blunt. It no longer wanted anything connecting it to that country. And Russia's response? 9 months later, the state enterprise filed to register Stoli as its own trademark inside Russia. You can't make this up. First they took Stolichnaya, now they wanted the name he invented to escape them. But by then, this had stopped being a war of lawyers, and it started consuming everyone. In July 2024, a Russian court declared Scheffler's group an extremist association. The official reason included donations to Ukraine and confiscated his last remaining assets in Russia. Weeks later, a ransomware attack gutted the company's global IT systems. Staff were doing the accounting by hand on paper. And in November 2024, Stoli's American businesses, the heart of the brand's biggest market, filed for bankruptcy in Texas, around $84 million in debt. In the court filings, the CEO blamed the hackers and the Russian state in the same breath. The dominoes kept falling, and the last one fell in Riga. In early 2026, Latvia's Balsams itself, the fortress factory, went into court protection. It owed Latvia tens of millions in taxes. Dragged down, the company said, by the cyber attack and the loss of the group's Russian assets, with its American market in bankruptcy on top. A quarter of a century of war, and this is where it ends. Or rather, where it stands, because nobody surrendered. The American arm sits under court-appointed trustees. The Riga factory is restructuring. The global company keeps operating. Russia keeps its 17 trademarks and its Benelux victories. Scheffler, holder of British and Israeli passports, worth around $1 billion, with homes from London to Jurmala, keeps the rest of the world. So who won the Vodka War? Russia spent 25 years and got a brand its enemy voluntarily abandoned. Scheffler bought an empire for $300,000, built it into $1 billion brand, and watched war, hackers, and bankruptcy grind it down. The state got the name, the exile got the world, and the vodka never went home. Here's the part that stays with you. Every empire in this story was destroyed by the same thing that built it: its Russian identity. Being Russian made Stolichnaya famous, and then it made it radioactive. And if you think trading soda for warships sounds too insane to be real, the full story of the deal that supposedly turned Pepsi into a naval power, and what really happened, is right here. Trust me, it's even crazier than this one. I'll see you there.